Welcome back. Today we're stepping into the streets of New York City in 1946, a time ruled by fear, power, and legends, when an elderly woman did the unthinkable and calmly confronted Bumpy Johnson, one of Harlem's most feared figures, and what happened next stunned the entire city. This isn't fiction or rumor. It's a story pieced together through real historical accounts, court records, and eyewitness reports, because we spend countless hours digging for true, verified data so you get facts, not hype. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you appreciate deeply researched, true stories like this. Make sure you subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming next. In 1946, New York City stood at a powerful crossroads between war and peace, chaos and hope. World War II had ended only months earlier, and the city, long considered the heartbeat of America, was trying to redefine itself. Soldiers poured back into neighborhoods they barely recognized, bringing with them stories of victory, trauma, and loss. The celebratory energy of the war's end still lingered in the air. It was now mixed with anxiety about jobs, housing, and the future. New York was alive, crowded, and restless, a city moving fast without fully knowing where it was headed. The return of veterans placed enormous pressure on the city's infrastructure. Housing shortages became severe as families doubled up in cramped apartments and landlords exploited rent controls. Entire neighborhoods in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Harlem felt the strain. At the same time, factories that had thrived during wartime began laying off workers as military contracts disappeared. Labor strikes erupted across the city, halting transportation and manufacturing, reminding everyone that peace brought its own battles. Economic uncertainty shaped daily life, especially for working-class families struggling to stay afloat. Crime and organized power filled the gaps left by weak institutions and social inequality. Organized crime syndicates, Italian, Jewish, and Black, operated openly, controlling gambling, narcotics, and underground economies. Corruption ran deep, blurring the lines between law enforcement, politics, and the underworld. In many neighborhoods, people trusted local power brokers more than the police. Fear and respect governed the streets, and reputation meant everything. In this environment, figures like Bumpy Johnson were not just criminals, but symbols of authority and order. Harlem in 1946 was a place of deep contrasts. It remained a cultural center for Black America, rich with music, churches, and community pride, yet burdened by poverty, overcrowded housing, and systemic racism. Segregation may not have been written into law. It was enforced through discrimination in employment, housing, and policing. Harlem residents relied heavily on community leaders, both lawful and unlawful, to resolve disputes and provide protection. Respect carried more weight than written law. Outsiders rarely understood the rules that governed daily life. Social hierarchy in 1946 New York was sharply defined, yet surprisingly sensitive to tradition and symbolism. Elders, especially elderly women, held quiet but powerful moral authority within their communities. They were seen as keepers of values, faith, and history. While they rarely confronted public figures, when they did, their words carried unusual weight. In a city ruled by intimidation and reputation, such a confrontation could disrupt even the most feared power structures. Information in 1946 spread through newspapers, radios, and most powerfully, word of mouth. Barbershops, street corners, churches, nightclubs acted as unofficial newsrooms. Stories did not need proof to travel, they needed belief. Once a story captured public imagination, it quickly became part of the city's collective memory. New York had always been a city of stories. During this period of uncertainty, people listened more closely than ever. New York City in 1946 was tense but balanced, dangerous yet deeply ordered by unwritten rules. It was a city preparing for massive change, even if it did not yet realize it. The civil rights movement, federal crackdowns on organized crime, and urban transformation were all approaching. Moments that broke expectations stood out sharply against this backdrop. In such a city, a single unexpected encounter could ripple across neighborhoods and become legend, because New York in 1946 was always watching, listening, and remembering. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, better known as Bumpy Johnson, was far more complex than the simple label of gangster suggests. Born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, Bumpy moved to Harlem as a teenager after racial violence forced his family north. From an early age, he was shaped by anger, intelligence, and a sharp awareness of injustice. Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s offered limited paths for young black men, and Bumpy quickly learned that power, respect, and survival often existed outside the law. By the 1940s, his name alone carried weight across New York City. Bumpy Johnson rose to prominence under the mentorship of Stephanie St. Clair, the formidable Harlem numbers queen. Unlike many street criminals, Bumpy was disciplined, strategic, and unusually intellectual. He was known to read philosophy, history, and poetry, often quoting Shakespeare or writing verse of his own while in prison. This combination of violence and intellect made him different. He was feared not just for his capacity for brutality, but for his calm, calculated approach to power. People never knew whether they would meet a gentleman or an executioner. By 1946, Bumpy Johnson effectively controlled much of Harlem's illegal economy, particularly gambling operations. He negotiated directly with Italian mafia families, something extremely rare for a black crime figure at the time. Rather than being subordinate, Bumpy carved out a unique position as an equal partner, enforcing boundaries and protecting Harlem's interests. This balance required absolute authority within his territory. Challenges were met swiftly. Loyalty was rewarded generously, but betrayal was never forgiven. Despite his violent reputation, many Harlem residents viewed Bumpy as a protector rather than a predator. He was known to help struggling families with rent, food, and legal assistance. Stories circulated of him paying college tuition, supporting churches, and intervening when residents were mistreated by outsiders or corrupt police. Whether driven by genuine loyalty to Harlem or strategic self-interest, his actions created a complicated legacy, one where fear and gratitude existed side by side. Bumpy's relationship with law enforcement was defined by constant surveillance, arrests, and imprisonment. He spent nearly half his life behind bars, yet incarceration never diminished his influence. Even from prison, orders flowed through trusted associates. His silence under pressure became legendary. He never cooperated with authorities, reinforcing his reputation as a man of unbreakable code. This refusal to talk elevated his status among criminals and deepened the fear he inspired among rivals. What truly set Bumpy Johnson apart was his sense of respect and rules. He believed in boundaries, especially within Harlem. Random violence, unnecessary cruelty, and harm to community elders were considered violations of his personal code. These rules were not moral in the traditional sense, but they mattered deeply in a lawless environment. When those boundaries were crossed or challenged, it was taken seriously, regardless of who initiated the confrontation. By 1946, Bumpy Johnson was more than a man. He was a symbol of power, contradiction, and survival in New York City. To some, he was a ruthless criminal. To others, a necessary authority in a city that offered little protection to black communities. His presence commanded silence, obedience, and caution. Is why any unexpected encounter involving Bumpy, especially one that challenged him publicly, was destined to become legend. In a city ruled by reputation, Bumpy Johnson's was among the most feared of all. In 1946, Harlem operated under a power structure that was largely invisible to outsiders, but deeply understood by those who lived there. Official authority, police, city officials, and courts existed, but it was distant, inconsistent, and often hostile toward the black community. As a result, a parallel system of power developed, one rooted in reputation, influence, and control rather than law. This system governed daily life, resolved conflicts, and enforced order in ways the city could not or would not. At the top of Harlem's informal hierarchy were crime bosses, numbers runners, and influential community figures who controlled money and protection. Illegal gambling, especially the numbers game, was the economic backbone of this system. It provided jobs, income, and stability for thousands of residents. Those who controlled these operations also controlled loyalty. Power was not only about violence, it was about who could provide help, settle disputes, and keep outsiders in check. Beneath the top figures were enforcers, lieutenants, and trusted intermediaries who ensured that rules were followed. These individuals were known faces on the streets. They collected debts, protected territory, and passed along messages. Their presence maintained order through fear and familiarity. Everyone knew who they were, and everyone knew the consequences of disrespecting them. Violence was used selectively because too much chaos threatened the balance that kept the system functioning. Church leaders, business owners, and long-standing community elders formed another layer of Harlem's power structure. While they did not engage in criminal activity, they carried moral and social authority. Their approval or disapproval mattered. Crime figures often respected these leaders, understanding that community support was essential for long-term control. When tensions arose, these elders sometimes acted as mediators, preventing conflicts from escalating into open violence. Race played a crucial role in shaping Harlem's power dynamics. Italian mafia families dominated much of New York's underworld, but Harlem remained a rare space where black leadership retained control. This autonomy was fiercely protected. Any attempt by outsiders to impose authority without permission was met with resistance. Negotiations with outside crime families were conducted carefully, often through established power brokers, to maintain Harlem's independence. Respect was the foundation of Harlem's power structure. Disrespect, whether verbal, physical, or symbolic, could not be ignored. A single public challenge could undermine authority if left unanswered. At the same time, displays of restraint could strengthen power by demonstrating confidence and control. Every action was measured because reputation traveled fast in a tightly connected community. By 1946, Harlem's power structure was stable but fragile, built on unwritten rules and mutual understanding rather than formal law. It functioned because people believed in it and feared disrupting it. This made unexpected moments, especially those involving unlikely figures, extraordinarily powerful. When someone outside the usual hierarchy stepped forward, it challenged not just an individual, but the entire system. In Harlem, such moments were never forgotten. The elderly woman at the center of this story was not a public figure, nor was she known for influence or power beyond her immediate community. Like many older women in Harlem during the 1940s, she lived a quiet, routine, driven life shaped by decades of hardship, faith, and responsibility. She had witnessed Harlem's transformation, from its hopeful rise during the Great Migration to the struggles brought on by overcrowding, poverty, and neglect. Her life experience gave her a deep understanding of the neighborhood's unspoken rules. She belonged to a generation that valued dignity, restraint, and moral responsibility. Having lived through the Great Depression, racial violence, and 2 world wars, she understood loss and endurance better than most. Survival had taught her patience, but also courage. In Harlem, elderly women were often caretakers, church members, and community anchors, people others turned to for advice, comfort, and moral guidance. Their authority did not come from fear, but from respect earned over a lifetime. Her daily life was modest. She likely relied on a fixed income, community support, or family assistance. Yet her presence carried weight. People greeted her. Children were expected to behave around her. Neighbors listened when she spoke. In an environment dominated by fast money and street power, she represented stability and tradition. She was part of the social fabric that held the community together when institutions failed. Faith almost certainly played a central role in her life. Churches in Harlem were more than places of worship. They were centers of social order, mutual aid, and moral authority. Elderly women were often deeply involved in church life, organizing events, caring for the sick, and reinforcing values of respect and accountability. This spiritual grounding gave her confidence and a sense of moral clarity that outweighed fear. Importantly, she was not ignorant of Harlem's power dynamics. She knew who controlled the streets. She knew what names carried danger. Her age and experience meant she understood the risks involved in speaking to powerful men. This awareness makes her actions more significant, not reckless, but deliberate. She stepped forward knowing exactly what she was doing and what it could cost. In Harlem's unwritten social code, elderly women occupied a protected space. Harming or publicly disrespecting them was considered a serious violation even among criminals. This protection was not absolute, but it was widely respected. Her age and status gave her a unique position, one that allowed her to speak when others could not. Her voice carried the weight of community values rather than personal ambition. 1946, the elderly woman symbolized something deeper than herself. She represented history, morality, and the collective conscience of Harlem. Her background explains why her actions resonated so strongly and why her words could not be ignored. In a city ruled by fear and reputation, she stood as a reminder that some forms of authority could not be bought, threatened, or silenced. The elderly woman did not approach Bumpy Johnson on impulse. Her decision was shaped by mounting concern and a sense of responsibility that had been building over time. Whatever prompted her action had reached a point where silence no longer felt acceptable. In Harlem, people learned early when to stay quiet, but they also learned that there were moments when speaking up mattered more than personal safety. For her, this was one of those moments. At the heart of her decision was likely a personal connection to the situation. It may have involved a family member, a neighbor, or someone from her church who had been affected, directly or indirectly, by the consequences of street power. While Bumpy Johnson enforced rules, his influence still touched many lives. For an elderly woman rooted in her community, seeing someone she cared about suffer could override fear. Moral conviction played a powerful role. She came from a generation that believed wrongdoing should be confronted, especially when it harmed the innocent. Even in a lawless environment, there were lines that should not be crossed. Her approach was not about challenging authority for its own sake, but about appealing to conscience. She believed that even the most feared men were still accountable to certain moral standards. Her faith likely strengthened her resolve. Religious belief often gave elderly women in Harlem a sense of protection and purpose. She may have felt guided by a higher authority, believing that truth spoken with sincerity would carry weight. This spiritual confidence allowed her to face a man others avoided, trusting that respect and honesty could succeed where threats and defiance would fail. Timing also mattered. Harlem's power structure relied heavily on reputation, and Bumpy Johnson was known to value respect and order. She may have chosen a moment when he was visible but not surrounded by chaos, when a private but public enough conversation could occur. Her approach was strategic, shaped by an understanding of how power operated on the streets. Importantly, her age and status gave her a rare kind of leverage. She knew that harming her would carry severe consequences, both socially and symbolically. This did not make her fearless, but it gave her confidence. She understood that her position as an elder provided a shield, however thin, against retaliation. Ultimately, she approached Bumpy Johnson because she believed her voice mattered. She was not acting as an individual alone, as a representative of community values, history, and conscience. In a city where power was enforced through fear, her action was a quiet assertion that some authority came from standing up when others could not. The encounter took place in Harlem, not in a hidden alley or private room, but in a space where people could see and remember. Location mattered deeply in 1946 New York, especially in neighborhoods governed by reputation and visibility. Powerful figures like Bumpy Johnson rarely moved without intention, and the places they appeared were carefully chosen. Wherever this meeting occurred, it was somewhere that carried symbolic weight within the community. Harlem streets were more than pathways. They were stages, sidewalks, storefronts, and building entrances served as informal gathering points where news traveled and authority was observed. If the encounter happened near a business, social club, or well-known corner, it ensured that witnesses were present. Even a small crowd was enough for an interaction to become part of neighborhood lore. Public spaces in Harlem operated under unwritten rules. Everyone knew who controlled which blocks and who was allowed to speak freely. Elderly woman stepping forward in such a space disrupted expectations. Her presence alone drew attention because it violated the usual power dynamics. People nearby would have sensed immediately that something unusual was happening. Bumpy Johnson himself was closely associated with specific locations, clubs, offices, or corners where his authority was recognized. Approaching him in one of these places was significant. It meant confronting him on ground where he was most powerful, yet also most visible. Balance made the encounter impossible to ignore. The timing of the location also mattered. Daylight encounters carried different implications than those at night. A daytime setting suggested openness and moral confidence, while nighttime implied secrecy. If this happened during the day, it reinforced the seriousness of her intent and reduced the likelihood of violence. It signaled that her words were meant to be heard, hidden. Witnesses in Harlem did not need to speak for a story to spread. Simply seeing the interaction was enough. People would recount what they observed, filling in details through conversation and interpretation. The location ensured the encounter could not be dismissed or denied. It happened in plain sight, where memory could not be erased. Choosing or accepting a visible location, the encounter became more than a private exchange. It became a public moment, woven into Harlem's collective memory. In a city where reputation ruled, where power depended on perception, the place where something happened often mattered as much as what was said. In 1946 Harlem, very few significant moments happened without witnesses. The neighborhood was dense, social, and constantly alive. When the elderly woman approached Bumpy Johnson, there were almost certainly people nearby, residents, passers-by, shopkeepers, or associates, who noticed the interaction. Even those who pretended not to look were aware that something unusual was unfolding. Witnesses in Harlem understood the importance of observation. Speaking openly about powerful figures could be dangerous. Watching and remembering was not. People learned to absorb details quietly, the tone of voices, body language, how long an interaction lasted. These silent observations later became stories shared in safe spaces, shaping collective understanding of events. Bumpy Johnson's associates would have been among the first to notice. Men tasked with protecting him were alert to any unexpected approach, especially from strangers. An elderly woman stepping forward would have triggered immediate tension, not because she was a threat, but because she disrupted protocol. Their reactions, whether they intervened or stepped back, would have signaled the seriousness of the moment to everyone watching. Local residents, especially elders and long-time community members, would have viewed the encounter differently from outsiders. They recognized the woman not as a random person, but as someone with social standing. Her age alone commanded attention. Witnesses understood that harming or dismissing her would carry consequences far beyond the immediate scene. Shopkeepers and business owners were particularly important witnesses. Their stores acted as informal observation posts, and they often served as trusted narrators of neighborhood events. What they saw and later repeated carried credibility. If they spoke about the encounter, people listened, knowing these individuals had no reason to exaggerate. Even children present would have sensed the gravity of the moment. Harlem's youth learned early how to read power and danger. Seeing an elderly woman calmly confront a feared figure would leave a lasting impression. Such moments shaped how stories were remembered and passed down across generations. The presence of witnesses ensured that the encounter could not be reduced to rumor alone. Multiple perspectives, shared quietly over time, gave the story durability. In Harlem, memory was a form of record keeping. What people saw, they carried with them. And that is how this moment became part of the city's living history. When the elderly woman approached Bumpy Johnson, those watching expected tension, interruption, or swift dismissal. Bumpy's reputation was built on fear and authority, and most encounters with him were carefully managed by associates. Yet his reaction did not follow the script people anticipated. Instead of immediate anger or intimidation, he paused, an action that alone signaled something unusual was taking place. Bumpy was a man deeply aware of perception. He understood that every public interaction contributed to his reputation. Reacting violently or disrespectfully toward an elderly woman would not project strength, it would signal insecurity. His ability to control his response demonstrated discipline, a quality that separated him from lesser figures in the underworld. Silence, in that moment, was power. Accounts of Bumpy often emphasize his respect for elders and community boundaries. His reaction reflected an internal code he rarely broke. While he was capable of extreme violence, he was also deliberate about when and where to use it. Facing an elderly woman, he recognized the moral weight of the situation. This was not a challenge to be crushed, but a message to be heard. Witnesses would have noticed his body language closely. Whether he leaned in to listen, nodded, or simply stood still, these small details mattered. Bumpy Johnson understood that gestures spoke as loudly as words. By allowing her to speak without interruption, he signaled to everyone watching that this encounter was different and that her presence commanded respect. His associates, trained to react instantly to threats, would have taken their cues from him. If Bumpy did not move, neither did they. This restraint reinforced his authority. He did not need force to control the situation. The power in that moment came from his choice not to escalate, rather than from fear alone. Whatever words Bumpy responded with, whether brief or measured, they were likely calm and controlled. He was known for choosing language carefully, especially in public. A thoughtful response would have reinforced the idea that he was listening, not dismissing. This reaction would later become a key part of how the story was remembered and retold. Bumpy Johnson's reaction transformed the encounter from a potential confrontation into a defining moment. By showing restraint and respect, he altered expectations and deepened his legend. In a city where power was often proven through force, his response demonstrated a different kind of authority, one rooted in control, awareness, and understanding of the moment's significance. As the encounter ended, there was a brief moment of stillness, the kind that follows something unexpected. People nearby did not immediately return to their conversations or routines. Instead, there was a quiet awareness that they had just witnessed something out of the ordinary. In Harlem, where confrontations often ended loudly or violently, the calm conclusion itself felt significant. Bumpy Johnson's associates would have moved first, subtly reforming their protective circle and guiding him away without urgency. Their composed behavior signaled that the situation was resolved, not ignored. The elderly woman, having said what she came to say, was left untouched and unharmed. That alone spoke volumes to those watching. Whispers began almost immediately. People exchanged looks, leaned toward one another, and quietly asked what had just happened. No one shouted. No one rushed forward. Harlem's code encouraged discretion, but curiosity was impossible to suppress. Each witness carried a fragment of the moment, ready to be shared later in safer spaces. Within hours, the story began to travel. It moved through barbershops, churches, social clubs, and street corners. Details varied slightly, but the core remained the same. An elderly woman had approached Bumpy Johnson, spoken to him, and walked away unharmed. In a neighborhood governed by fear and reputation, that fact alone made the story powerful. The woman herself returned to her daily life, but her status subtly changed. People looked at her differently, not with fear, but with admiration and quiet respect. She had done something most would never dare. Yet she did not boast or seek attention, reinforcing the sincerity of her action. Bumpy Johnson's reputation also shifted, though not weakened. If anything, it grew more complex. The story painted him not just as a feared figure, but as a man capable of restraint and respect. This nuance added depth to his legend, reinforcing the idea that his authority rested on control as much as intimidation. The immediate aftermath ensured that the encounter did not fade into obscurity. It became a shared reference point, a moment people returned to when discussing power, courage, and respect in Harlem. In a city that remembered through stories, this moment was already beginning its transformation into legend. Once the story left the immediate block where the encounter occurred, it began to travel quickly through Harlem's tightly connected social networks. Word spread first through trusted voices, barbers, church members, club employees, and long-time residents who were known for accuracy rather than exaggeration. In a city like New York, credibility determined how far a story could go, and this one carried the weight of multiple witnesses. From Harlem, the story moved outward into neighboring communities. Taxi drivers, porters, and service workers, people who moved constantly between neighborhoods, played a crucial role in spreading the news. They carried fragments of the story across boroughs, repeating it in diners, union halls, and apartment buildings. Each retelling reinforced the sense that something extraordinary had taken place. The encounter gained traction because it challenged expectations. Stories involving Bumpy Johnson usually ended in intimidation or violence. This one did not. The contrast made people pause and listen. Even those far removed from Harlem understood the significance of an elderly woman confronting a powerful figure and walking away unharmed. While newspapers may not have reported the event directly, the city's informal information channels were often faster and more influential. Gossip columns, whispered conversations, and second-hand accounts carried emotional truth even when details varied. In 1946 New York, this kind of underground circulation shaped public perception as effectively as headlines. Among law enforcement and political circles, the story was noted quietly. Officials who tracked Harlem's power dynamics paid attention to anything that hinted at shifts in authority or public sentiment. The encounter did not signal weakness, but it did reveal complexity, something authorities both feared and underestimated. As the story spread, it began to take on symbolic meaning. To some, it represented moral courage. To others, it demonstrated Bumpy Johnson's control and discipline. Different audiences interpreted it through their own experiences, allowing the story to resonate across racial, social, and economic lines. By the time the story had circulated beyond Harlem, it was no longer just about two individuals. It had become part of New York's larger narrative, a reminder that even in a city ruled by power and fear, unexpected moments could reshape how legends were understood and remembered. The encounter subtly but powerfully reshaped how Bumpy Johnson was viewed across Harlem and beyond. His reputation had long been defined by fear, enforcement, and silence, but this moment added a new layer. People began to speak of him not only as a feared figure, but as a man capable of restraint and discernment. In a city where reputation was everything, nuance mattered. Among those within the underworld, the incident reinforced Bumpy's authority rather than weakening it. His ability to handle a potentially volatile situation without violence demonstrated control. Other figures understood the message clearly. He did not act out of impulse. He chose his responses carefully, and that made him more dangerous, not less, within the Harlem community, especially among elders and long-time residents. His standing grew more complex. Some saw his reaction as evidence that he respected community values and moral boundaries. This perception strengthened his legitimacy as a protector of the neighborhood, even among those who disapproved of his criminal activities. Younger men on the streets took notice as well. They learned that power was not only about intimidation, about knowing when not to use it. The story became an informal lesson in leadership and reputation. Bumpy Johnson was not just feared, he was studied. Law enforcement and rival organizations interpreted the encounter differently. To them, it confirmed that Bumpy was deeply rooted in the community and understood how to maintain loyalty. This made him harder to isolate or undermine. His influence was not limited to violence, it extended into social respect. The story also insulated Bumpy from certain forms of criticism. Publicly mistreating an elderly woman would have damaged him irreparably, even among his own. By avoiding that mistake, he preserved his image and reinforced his internal code. In the long run, this restraint protected his position more effectively than force ever could. Ultimately, the impact on Bumpy Johnson's reputation was lasting. The encounter became part of his legend, a reminder that his power was rooted in control, awareness, and understanding of the community he dominated. In New York's oral history, this moment marked him not just as a feared man, but as a calculated one. This moment became legendary because it defied everything people expected in 1946 New York. The city was ruled by fear, hierarchy, and unspoken rules, and rarely did those rules bend without violence. Elderly woman calmly approaching one of Harlem's most feared figures and leaving unharmed felt almost impossible. Contradiction captured people's attention immediately. The power of the moment lay in its symbolism. It was not just a meeting between two individuals, but a collision between moral authority and street power. The woman represented tradition, community values, and conscience, while Bumpy Johnson embodied fear, control, and reputation. Their interaction suggested that even the strongest street power recognized certain boundaries. Witnesses played a crucial role in transforming the encounter into legend. Multiple people saw it happen, remembered it, and retold it over time. Each retelling preserved the core truth while adding emotional depth. In a city where oral history mattered, repetition gave the story permanence. The timing made it unforgettable. Post-war New York was questioning authority, power, and identity. People were searching for meaning in everyday moments. This encounter offered a story that felt larger than life, yet deeply human. It reflected the tension of a city trying to redefine itself. The legend endured because it humanized both figures. The elderly woman was no longer invisible, and Bumpy Johnson was no longer one-dimensional. The story allowed people to see courage and restraint in unexpected places, making it resonate across generations. As years passed, the story became a reference point used to explain Harlem's unwritten rules, the nature of power, and the limits of fear. It was shared quietly, with respect, often as a lesson rather than entertainment. That seriousness kept it alive. In the end, this moment became legendary because it captured a rare truth, even in a city defined by dominance and danger. Respect could still interrupt fear. New York remembered it not for what was said, but for what it revealed about power, courage, and the human spirit.